Hello. Today I'd like to take a look at an issue concerning so-called mental illness. And my contention is, at the present time, that much of what is talked about as mental illness and origins of it has in fact very little to do with genetics, other than perhaps a predisposition for a certain body type that makes one more vulnerable to violence, actions of violence, being less able to defend yourself. Let's say if you're an ectomorph and very thin and frail, or very short, or many a woman in a marriage with a violent husband, perhaps. But other than these issues of genetics determining your body size and sex, I would say that issues of struggle emotionally, which tend to get labeled as mental illness all too often, don't have much at all to do with genetics. And furthermore, I would also say often that trauma in childhood also plays a limited role, and that a major factor in what we call emotional stress, or stress in general, and then typically getting labeled mental illness, is in fact due to social issues, including the environment we live in. Now, to start with, on this topic of social issues, of emotional suffering, what some would call mental illness, I would say I'd like to look back at something I listened to a couple weeks ago, a audio about the topic of a particular diagnosis rendered by some psychiatrists and psychologists today, and that is borderline personality disorder. The audio put out on this topic in particular came from the so-called father of this diagnosis, a Dr. John Gunderson, who recently passed away at age 76. He talked at length about this for many years, many decades, and one of his contentions in the audio was that borderline personality disorder has a very strong genetic component. Now, before I go on further, I would just give a 2-second explanation of his view on this so-called illness, that such patients of his are characterized with having insecure attachments and difficulty being alone, that, in his words, being alone is often intolerable to them because it is associated with a profound sense of being bad or evil. He wrote, "A self-image distortion accompanied by such intense feelings of guilt or shame that the question of worthiness to live often follows." He furthermore then said that in therapy, borderline patients play rough. They are by turns charming and mocking, detached and enraged, bullying and needy, often threatening suicide. Now, after a point in his audio message on his topic of borderline personality disorder, and thus saying that there was a strong genetic component, he also talked of how many or most staff members at psychiatric hospitals that he was involved in over the years treating such persons had considerable contempt even, or disgust for these patients, although he didn't word it in exactly those words. But he did say that he found such patients to be very trying in essence. I would also say that I believe many psychologists and psychiatrists would find narcissists, so to speak, very trying too, and for many of the same reasons, that both of these types of individuals, if you wanted to classify them with these terminologies, tend to put down the self-esteem of the practitioner trying to help. But often I might maintain, for very good reason, that very typically the social class of the patient is very low compared to the helper, so to speak, who is often what you might call well-heeled, wealthy, even rich in comparison, such that the patient might seem to smell a rat and find the practitioner contemptuous in their eyes, and the practitioner in return, feeling an impact of their self-esteem lowering, would in turn react the same way toward the patient, finding the patient in turn contemptuous, because the practitioner is finding his self-esteem impacted, whether from a so-called borderline person or narcissist. And so, in an outpatient setting, probably such persons would be shuffled off quickly with, quote, medications administered, and that'd be the end. And with the final adage being that narcissists are basically untreatable, as are all personality disordered persons. And I'd put an exclamation point at the end of that. But in fact, I would think that this is often said to be so because the practitioner generally can't handle insults to their self-esteem. Their self-esteem is too shaky. So they quickly give up and fold and say these people are untreatable and just shuffle them off to be treated with drugs only. Now, to continue, about 10 or 15 minutes later into Dr. Gunderson's audio, he mentioned something that totally contradicted his view of earlier saying there was a very strong genetic component. What he said then, later, is that amazingly, he and his staff found that given a change in environment for these clients or patients, that there was often a radical change for the better, you might say remission or cure. And so this then leads me on to talk more about the environmental factors that influence so-called mental illness. For indeed, many of us have had significant trauma in our past, but not everybody goes on to have a train wreck of a life afterward. I would say that beyond a genetic component dictating your sex or body type and vulnerability to violence in general, that your environment then plays a huge factor in how well you process what happened to you earlier, call it trauma or not, or what degree of it, such that in the proper environments and given enough time on hand, a person can come to put two and two together, so to speak, and heal remarkably. You might say, in essence, that the body and the mind are very self-healing, but only under the proper environments. For instance, a soldier on the battlefield who develops what might be called post-traumatic stress disorder from the violence of everyday combat is generally or hopefully taken off the battlefield to help heal him, theoretically. That if you leave the person on the battlefield, the chances of recovery are much less. Although in today's world, such soldiers might be given pills and urged to go back to the front the next day. Again, the same idea, that if the environment is toxic, too stressful in many a way, healing from whatever trauma did happen earlier in life will probably be impossible. And the best coping method then would just be to medicate the problems away by dulling the person's mind. But ideally, a shift for the better in the environment could do miracles, so to speak. I'd give a final example, and that is of a man named Bob Wells, W-E-L-L-S, who once went through a very traumatic divorce earlier in life and found himself living in a box van because he couldn't afford rent after divorce, what with child support and alimony to pay. And so he lived 6 years in a box van, and later, through blogging and YouTubing, found that there were an amazing number of other people who could resonate with the same situation he had been in some form or fashion. He later went on to talk of how, in living in what you would call a box van or RV, that his time out west, where such living was more accommodating in terms of our country's laws, was very, very healing. He said that nature was very healing. Or, in other words, in a general sense, I would say the proper environment, the ideal environment. To include plenty of time on your hands, too, whereby if you have to work much less to put a roof over your head, in other words, an RV-type roof, that you'll have much more time to process whatever happened to you and come to better equanimity. But alas, Dr. Gunderson, in an article I had just been looking at, was dressed in a suit with a bow tie and had worked for many years at a psychiatric hospital associated with Harvard University. And so, you might say he was quite wealthy, upper middle class perhaps in social status, and who under those circumstances could be expected or find himself desiring to address social issues that put incredible pressure on people, let alone heavily acting against any kind of recovery from trauma in childhood or later, let's say from a marriage or illness at an early age. And so his approach would naturally have been to say things generally have a very large genetic component and try to medicate these things away instead of addressing huge social issues. Now, what social issues am I talking about? Well, I would go into a little bit of my time in my 20s, when I found myself moving from Kentucky after time in the Army and then getting out, to San Diego, California. I'd say I was age 26 at the time. And moving from Kentucky with small highways to a major urban center where the freeways I had to take each day to work were 4 lanes each direction was quite a shift. Additionally, the only housing I could afford was basically in the ghetto. And as such, I ran into all kinds of interesting situations, to include so many cockroaches all over the apartment that I had to keep everything perishable food item-wise in the fridge. Also, it got very warm in the apartment inland, 10 miles inland, and there was no air conditioning. Next, there was a pool outdoors with constant noise then, many times during the year. And of course, a 1-year lease made things very sticky as per moving. Then, of course, living in the ghetto with some of the cheapest rent prices around, which were quite high, by the way, compared to Kentucky earlier. Who knows what neighbors were using heroin or meth or other drugs. At any rate, there were almost nobody I felt comfortable talking with. Additionally, on the weekends, helicopters would circle around the neighborhood 7 or 8 o'clock at night, looking for illegal immigrants from Mexico 20 miles to the south. Finally, to top all that off, my car was stolen. A brand new car. And so, this is what I'm talking about by social issues contributing to so-called mental illness or high stress, which can, by the way, escalate into diagnoses far beyond stress or simple depression, unfortunately. So this is one of my major contentions, is that much stress that contributes tremendously to great emotional suffering can come from simply what you'd call bad housing or substandard housing, to put it more lightly. That this was all I could afford for 3 or 4 years, in fact. And when I started at a job there, things went much better for me than 4 years later, by which time this whole environment and the job environment, with almost minimum wage pay, ate away at my emotionality in terms of ability to cope. Now, this is not surprising. This is part and parcel of living in America for many people, unfortunately. And what I believe makes for such a dog-eat-dog world in America today, the striving to not find yourself in such a situation. That we would do anything, and I mean anything, not to have this happen to us. Now, it would have been very nice if someone providing me counseling at the time had said to me, "You should definitely leave this urban jungle, this madhouse, and get somewhere north of here, north of Los Angeles, say, if you still want to stay in California. And get to some place saner, less stressful." But no, this didn't happen. Most practitioners offering counseling would not be caught dead, unfortunately, in a rural community, especially where the rate of pay would be much less and far fewer customers, perhaps, at low pay. And so there was never any urging for me to restructure my environment, to cope with things in general. And of course, there was never any discussion either of moving into a van or RV or car. In fact, unfortunately, in America today, the biggest issue on all that being that it is illegal to sleep in your car at night. You might not want to try and even do so in the daytime. You will get arrested at night and put in jail. And so, this means that people trapped in urban environments can often never escape. And they just don't have enough emotional energy or money or even knowledge that there might be better situations out there, as I had no knowledge. My view was either a major metropolis or Kentucky. No one ever urged me to go to a small town in Northern California, let's say. Now next, I would talk about instabilities in a society as being a huge environmental factor too, not just your housing. And by instabilities, I mean a number of factors. For instance, the whole topic of globalization, whereby perhaps 30 or 40 years ago, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, for instance, and the end of the Cold War, too, the United States found ourselves competing greatly with Asian companies in particular for the production of goods at low cost, and Americans having a much higher standard of living, particularly for housing and transportation and medical care, compared to those persons in Southeast Asia, simply couldn't compete. And we found almost all our factories closing. Where at one point we had some 50 TV manufacturers in this country, we have maybe one or none now. Our standard of living making it impossible to create products here in many areas that people here can even afford or want to pay for, if offered especially the same product, often superior in quality from overseas somewhere, where production costs are much less because the standard of living is much less. How can we compete, for instance, wanting to live in a home that costs at least $150,000 minimum, when many an Asian working for a factory there overseas was content to some degree to live in a hut or on a boat packed in amongst other boats on rivers and estuaries and other water bodies. Their desires, their standards of living were so much less we couldn't compete. Now another factor contributing to instability is that many jobs, at least in Japan, say, in the past, were for life. Once you got hired on at some company in Japan way back, you probably figured you would retire there. But that is perhaps changing, and it's certainly a fantasy here in America. Indeed, even the concept of having a pension here in America now, and if you have one, it being fulfilled when you retire, is also becoming kind of a fantasy. Then next, what about the collapse of the idea of marriage, whereby, let's say, you did lose your job or had an illness or protracted illness or some kind of other stressor of big proportion. Then being married meant that you had backup, But in today's world, many people opt now not to be married, but simply to live together, with no contract, so to speak, such that if a partner kind of tweaks us the wrong way, or we have any other idea to do anything else, the lack of a legal contract makes it much easier to go our own ways, which could be good in many cases, but it can also leave us without backup if something happens to us, especially in older age. It also means, too, that another factor comes into play, the growth of the nuclear family, whereby, I don't know when, maybe 1960s, more and more people were having fewer and fewer children. And so with fewer children, as we parents would become old, we would not have children to help us. And of course, doubly an issue if those children we raised had been put in daycare, and the children really never bonded to us, and later in life had very little interest in helping us when we were elderly. So we have kind of a double whammy now. Fewer children to help, some of whom might not make it to the age of 60 when we're 80, and fewer of them not even wanting to help. Such that, take an Amish family, for instance, with maybe 8 to 12 children, there would always be at least some of them able to help the elderly parents. But in today's nuclear family idea in America, what if only one child is at age 60 able and willing to help? Well, this means that they could easily become overwhelmed by caretaking duties. And so the next thing you know, as we today get in our 60s and 70s, we worry considerably more about our future, with the result that today's society is highly oriented towards building a big nest egg for a nursing home that will not be a torture chamber for us, but tolerable at least. Of course, nursing homes in general, being a concept most people find necessary as a possible eventuality, given that there is no legal euthanasia allowed here in general. There have been, of course, some dalliances into it, but the paperwork and approval process makes it almost theoretically impossible to come by. And so another instability then is that we have fewer jobs and fewer pay rates, fewer pensions, less stability of jobs, and yet more need for more money to pile up for a possible nursing home, for the reasons I've outlined. Now, of course, this then is all a big stressor for people, and what I'm talking about exactly by environmental stressors. Yet another social stressor, if you will, not necessarily environmental but social, has to do with the decline of religion, for whatever reasons, including more and more emphasis on science and provability rather than intuition and big picture thinking. By religion, though, I mean more than just the image of a deity sitting in the clouds on a throne, a man with a beard, white whiskers, and all. I mean an approach to life that is oriented more towards accommodating to our stressors and trials and tribulations by looking inward and drawing inner resource strength, rather than trying to address issues, stressors, if you will, challenges and losses in general, by throwing money at it and the general approach then being to get the best job, the best training for jobs, and pile up the most money possible for eventualities in the future. Whereby in the past, we might have applied spirituality, if you will, to address future problems or present problems that were stressful by turning inward instead of throwing money at it. This then being a major social shift. And I'm not even talking then of the fact, too, that in today's world, few people, perhaps, America included, count on an afterlife. In other words, the idea you'll never die, but simply change your address someday. And additionally, get a pot at the end of the rainbow for all the suffering we went through. Again, a great social change, a great change in how we handle life's losses and stressors. There are many other factors. This is sort of an overview, this audio, this YouTube show, a brief whirlwind tour of my ideas on this topic. But I would ask that you bear with me, perhaps, and just to explore with me these things I find very curious at the least. Consider now the topic of keeping up with the Joneses and a ever-widening gap in income levels. Consider then what I would call then my version of this being how easy it is for us to compare ourselves with others, find ourselves coming up short, and feeling very distressed, feeling that life isn't fair, particularly in terms of housing or the type of job we have, whether it's interesting or not, and how stressful. The amount of money we might have coming in for all kinds of purposes, including piling it up for old age, for illness, good health care, insurance plans, life insurance, home health care, nursing homes, etc. Additionally, another major shift has been in how we treat our emotional struggles. 30, 40, 50 years ago, there was a major component of psychoanalysis in psychiatry. The man I mentioned, for instance, the so-called guru about borderline personality disorder, Dr. John Gunderson, was trained in Freudian psychoanalysis. But that has largely gone under. For a variety of reasons, I would say, but factors of affordability and the desire for quick cures, people moving around all the time, too few good analysts, too much concern for political correctness, and the best and brightest minds going to business and medicine other than psychiatry, finance, that sort of thing, entrepreneurship. There being very little money in comparison in providing therapy, so to speak, or analysis. And so this whole genre shifted to medications, drugs, suppressing our problems rather than trying to get to the root of things. Simultaneously, then, those who have had alcohol or drug issues of hard drug nature, heroin, meth, cocaine, etc., at one point might have found themselves or find themselves turning to a rehab facility for help, for so-called treatment. But as people like Grant Cardone or Russell Brand in England have talked of, both of who went through such facilities, people coming out, these people and others say, may vanquish a heroin addiction but have new addictions when they come out. They, in England for instance, generally get put on methadone, often for life. So they have a new drug of choice now. But nowhere is psychoanalysis ever provided in such facilities. Of course, that would take a considerable amount of time and money, very labor intensive. So the whole notion, the whole idea of addressing what caused the addiction in the first place gets swept under the rug. And they're simply drugged into controlled situations, if you will, but with muted emotions and stigmas resulting in the process in most cases. Yet another factor, consider healthcare costs, very high in America. And not only that, healthcare not exactly being a choice. For instance, if you stumbled, fell, and broke your leg while shopping, an ambulance would be called, whether you wanted it or not. You would go to the hospital against your will, if you desired otherwise, for whatever illness, and things could progress toward a cure or not so good of a cure. At any rate, as we get older, these treatments given to us are not a choice, and many will find themselves facing a nursing home or treatment in a hospital against their will, which may or may not turn out so well, especially depending on your financial situation. And so once again, with no choice of health care being given to us or not, and no euthanasia laws as an option for any of us, we find ourselves doubly, triply pressed to make as much money as possible for eventualities in older age, for the best medical care and best nursing homes as options for us all, which puts incredible stress on us and forces us often to do jobs we hate in the first place, with bosses we may hate, and tasks that have no interest to us in the first place, but we're stuck, we're chained. Now, of course there are many other issues too. I'm reminded, for instance, of a psychoanalyst, Rollo May, who once talked about, perhaps 30 years ago, of at least his fear, and many others, of a possible nuclear war. This video may have come out during the Cold War, but at any rate, this was a considerable fear to him and others, to be replaced, I might say, currently with concerns about global warming and environmental degradation of all sorts. And as one friend of mine put it, who was 80 recently, concern for your grandchildren and their future, their welfare. And so we've traded perhaps considerable fear of nuclear war for concern of the environment and continuation of our race and naturally our grandchildren's future. But this just gets better and better, doesn't it? For those who fall through the cracks or do something not so smart or even violate some minor law, they may quickly find themselves either homeless or in a prison, where conditions, in my opinion, can only be described as draconian. So not only do we have financial pressures on all of us now, but in the back of our minds, we all wonder if we'll be homeless tomorrow, especially with hardly any money saved up these days for many, consumer debt being huge. So we find ourselves very vulnerable in so many ways in general. Of course, many of the jobs today, too, have so little meaning and rush us so terribly to make efficiency experts very, very happy, perhaps, in corporations, but not us. Many jobs today are high-tech, high attention to detail, force us to be obsessive-compulsive if we weren't so to begin with, force many people to get college training they would otherwise not have pursued for decent jobs, in other words, decent pay, that will feed all sorts of things like the desire for better housing, better medical care, and better end of care in our end of life years. Yet another factor too, daycare. Since perhaps 1960s and the women's rights movement, daycare came into being big time. Grandmothers, other relatives, women staying at home much less to raise children. So much less bonding, much more parenting by what you might call rent-a-parents. And in my opinion then, part and parcel perhaps for talk these days of how millennials are so troubled compared to older generations. Now that's an overview and a generalization perhaps, but a shift anyway in our society big time. Yet another factor too to this laundry list, so to speak, overcrowding, population exploding. One book I read recently, part of, written a couple years ago, said that by 2060 there may be 100 million more people in America. Well, where are they all supposed to go? And things are going to get even more and more crowded, more and more stressful. And the bottom line, again, in my mind, being that all this stress is markedly contributing to what is called mental illness, which in turn finds ourselves being so heavily medicated and getting stigmas, and those stigmas impacting our job options and amount of pay we may receive. So, this has been a long series of items, but most of these things are no surprise to anyone listening or viewing, I would say, but I mention them simply to jog people's memories of things that are obvious to them but they tend to forget, especially in the hustle and bustle of life. And with the hope, too, of generating a big overall impression that although genetics can play a small role, I believe, in our emotional suffering and trauma a significant role, that many of us have considerable trauma. And again, the environment, in my mind, playing a huge role, and social changes too, such that these latter factors, the environment and social change, seem to be getting very short shrift as to a massive component in what is called mental illness or emotional struggles and that it's not going to get better, unfortunately, unless populations were to decrease, actually. And I personally don't know how this would happen, but it might be theoretically possible. I would leave with a little bit of humor. I once read that earlier in time in Romania, it was required to have a license before you could buy a TV. But who has ever heard of the requirement to have a license before you can have a child? And so, naturally, of course, administration of this would be impossible, and the desirability of such impossible on all sorts of scales to think of even. But at any rate, the bottom line being that perhaps way too many people have children they're not equipped to have, and many are having too many children for this world to sustain. And so I don't see things as changing. But this then is the challenge, and what I see is the big shift from trying to address things with either a spiritual approach or a cognitive approach, whether psychoanalysis or cognitive therapy, to a new approach in the last 20 years, say, of declaring everything basically to be biochemical and then drugging it all away as much as possible without addressing the roots of the issue. Now, if drugging things away is the only best option, I would say that's our best option. But I personally, and I hope some others think the same way in time too, more and more, that we shouldn't forget what would be most desirous, most optimal, and that would be to change the level of stress we face and the number of people on this planet, so that such dulling of our minds and the emotions and creativity then and the stigmas involved from such drugs would be less and less necessary. I hope that this somewhat controversial topic, perhaps, is useful, telling some people what they already knew, but in a good overview, I think. And again, as I say in some of my communications, good food for thought, at any rate, regardless of viewpoint on these topics. I wish you well.